They never gave me a reason, and I never asked for one. That's the kind of man I'd become after 17 years of classified work, half operator, half ghost. The email had no sender, no agency header, no encryption watermark. It simply appeared in my inbox one morning at 4:02, a time precise enough to make me suspicious and intrigued at once. The subject line read, "Assignment pending, priority black." No attachment, just a string of coordinates. A one-line directive, relocation required. Duration, indeterminate. And a signature I recognized from years back. C.M. Hewitt, a man I'd last seen being zipped into a body bag in Kandahar. I didn't reply. I packed. The drive took 14 hours northbound from my current residence. A rented 2-bedroom apartment I had barely lived in since returning from a failed op in the Azores. The coordinates led me to a stretch of nothing, somewhere between the Colorado Plateau and oblivion. Satellite views showed desert, but the ground told a different story. There was fencing, not chain link, but cold-rolled steel, seamless and dark as obsidian. It arced around a large depression in the land like a scar too proud to heal. No signage, no gate, just a breach wide enough for a single vehicle, as if inviting trespass only from those who knew better. When I passed through, my onboard GPS went dead. Power remained, but the screen turned to static. I kept driving. At some point, the air changed heavier, pressurized, like descending into altitude in reverse. My ears popped, but there was no mountain in sight. Just that flat, endless terrain that felt wrong to look at for too long, like it might look back. Then the hatch appeared. It wasn't a building, not even a bunker. It was just a metal slab embedded in the desert floor, large enough to accommodate a freight elevator. The dust around it was undisturbed, yet I could hear the faint mechanical hum beneath my boots, like something ancient trying to breathe again. There was no keypad, no retinal scanner, no human interface of any kind, just a slot 6 inches wide. I inserted the only thing I had received with the email, a black card with no print, no chip, no name. The hatch opened in complete silence. The descent took 11 minutes, straight down in a freight elevator lined with reflective steel. I counted the flicker of overhead lights to measure depth at 3 pulses. The walls offered no buttons, no markings. My phone showed no signal. When the elevator stopped, it did so without jolt or sound. The door slid open, and the air that met me was stale, recirculated, and faintly metallic. Inside, a hallway, long, windowless, concrete. Fluorescent tubes embedded in the ceiling flickered inconsistently, like they were remembering how to be lights. I stepped out, and the door closed behind me. I waited, listening. Nothing, just the sound of my own breath and the low mechanical purr of unseen machinery. The walls had strange patterns in them, imperfections that seemed deliberate. Not cracks, not wear, but something closer to veins, capillaries in the concrete. I walked until I reached a room labeled Obese 1 in faded stenciling. The door slid open on its own. Inside was a small terminal, an old military cot, a metal desk bolted to the floor, and a single bulb hanging from a chain that didn't sway. The terminal blinked on when I approached, showing only a single prompt, begin report log. That was my welcome. No commanding officer, no team, no orders beyond the act of presence itself, just a blinking cursor and the unshakable sense that I had arrived at the end of something that had never properly started. I tried the intercom. No signal. I explored the adjacent corridors. Most of them led to sealed doors, some welded shut, others humming with latent power. I found what resembled a supply room, racks of canned provisions, vacuum-packed meals, all labeled generically in a language that was almost English. Protein compound, Type D liquid ration 6A. The dates were recent, 2025, 2026. But some bore stamps from the 90s. Others had no dates at all. I stayed in that room for the next 2 nights, documenting everything on the terminal. Each day, the cursor awaited my report. No prompts, no feedback, just the expectation of surveillance. The feeling that I was not alone grew steadily. I had no contact with command, no evidence that any of this was even sanctioned. But food was restocked overnight, though I heard no footsteps. The air vents expelled warm, scented drafts that changed according to no schedule I could determine. Sometimes antiseptic, sometimes cedar. Once, it smelled unmistakably of gunpowder and damp wool. On day 4, I found the camera. It was embedded in the ceiling above my cot, the lens perfectly flush with the surface. I stared at it for a full hour, unmoving, and it stared back. I shaved my head that night not for discipline, but to feel where my skin ended and where the fear began. Sleep didn't come. The lights did not dim. They never had. The hallway outside OBS-1 led to what appeared to be a monitoring station, 20 inactive screens, all grey. One flickered for less than a second when I approached, displaying an image that I couldn't understand. Not a room, not a person, just a pattern, circular, fractal, recursive like a fingerprint etched into bone. It disappeared before I could blink. I didn't tell the terminal about it. I told the terminal nothing that day. By the end of week 1, I stopped counting hours. The clocks in the base were digital, but they disagreed with each other. My wristwatch gained 4 minutes, then lost 3. At one point, it showed 26 to 87. When I removed it, I felt nausea, as if I had unhooked something from my body. I left it on the desk, and in the morning, it was gone. I tried the elevator once, but the hatch never responded. The card no longer worked. I pounded on the wall until my hands bled. When I returned to my room, the cot had new sheets. The desk had a new pen red instead of black. The terminal cursor blinked in the same place, as if nothing had changed. The truth is, I don't remember arriving. Not really. The drive, the elevator, the initial silence it, all feels inserted, planted, like a memory too neat for the disorder that followed. The scars on my hand don't match any wound I recall receiving. One night I found blood beneath my nails, but no injury. A tooth went missing from my upper jaw, but there was no pain, no blood, just absence. There are no mirrors in the facility, none. I didn't notice that at first, but now I check every surface, every reflection, every shadow. When I look at my reflection in the black glass of a blank monitor, I swear it's not blinking when I do. And yet, I continue to write, because the cursor expects it, because the protocol, however unspoken, is encoded into my spine now. Report, record, remain. There is no exit, no contact, no past, no future, only the assignment. And no one has acknowledged it. Not even me. The base has no name, at least not one that was ever spoken aloud. And the coordinates that brought me here have since disappeared from every system I've checked. My laptop, which still powers on though its signal remains as dead as the sky above, now displays only a flashing underscore whenever I attempt to access the original email. When I tried entering the coordinates manually into an offline mapping tool I had archived years ago, the globe rendered as expected until it reached the region where this place should be. There, the terrain refused to load, as if the entire sector were corrupted, blurred with digital noise and then abruptly overwritten by generic desert topography. Nothing unique, nothing real, just a placeholder image, like a smile pasted over a corpse. I don't know what I expected, maybe a glitch, a red flag, some sign that my reality hadn't completely uncoupled itself from consensus. But what I got was silence. a silence deeper than any encryption. The few maps I managed to pull from the storage room inside the base were older than I thought possible, printed on fading paper stock. They bore Cold War-era insignias and annotations in military shorthand that even I had trouble deciphering. And I've been trained to read between lines that aren't meant to be read at all. On one, someone had circled this location, Reflied then drawn a thick black line through it, followed by a handwritten note in grease pencil, scrubbed "Do not reinstate." Another map listed it as Reduct Site 6, but the font was blurred, as though the ink had run before it could finish telling the truth. Reduct, not reactor, not research, not reserve. Reduct, a word that means nothing in any context I've known, unless it's not a place, but a process. I began to notice strange consistencies in the inconsistency. The internal compass I've relied on my whole life, years of land, nav, desert ops, mountain insertions, now wavers slightly, just enough to undermine my certainty. The facility doesn't align with true north, or magnetic north. It doesn't align with anything. When I try to retrace steps, corridors seem to shorten or lengthen. The same hallway leads to different ends depending on the direction I walk. At first I assumed fatigue, spatial disorientation, maybe a trick of airflow. But by the third day of this phenomenon, I started leaving physical markers. Scratches in the wall, chalk lines, subtle carvings. Every one of them would vanish within hours, or appear somewhere they didn't belong on a different wall, a different level. One mark I left at what I thought was a dead end appeared the next morning on the ceiling of my sleeping quarters. The stars. When visible from the facility's single surface level, viewporter reinforced slit, disguised beneath a folding blast shuttered, do not match standard celestial maps. I used to be able to identify constellations by heart. Now they twist into unfamiliar shapes. Orion's belt has 4 stars. Polaris flickers in colors I've never seen. Sometimes I look too long, hoping to spot the lie. But what I feel instead is a creeping certainty that the sky is not merely foreign, it is fabricated. Or worse, translated. Then came the humming. It started low, lower than auditory range, felt more than heard, a gentle vibration in the bones, like standing near high-tension power lines. It made my teeth ache and my fingertips tremble slightly, especially when I placed my hand against any structural surface. Walls, doors, even the cot frame, all of them carried the same subsonic resonance. I used a handheld analyzer from the monitoring bay, one of the few tools still functioning, and recorded consistent oscillations at 17 Hz, just below human hearing, and well within the range known to cause unease, nausea, and hallucinations under prolonged exposure. I should have been disturbed, but instead I felt centered, as though the base had finally acknowledged me, like I'd been attuned. And so I started charting it. The humming ebbs and flows with no regard for power cycles. It's not tied to the base's generator, which is buried deep beneath the maintenance deck and hums with a different signature, entirely clean, nuclear, regulated. This resonance comes from elsewhere. From beneath, yes, but deeper than any infrastructure map suggests. I suspect something under the foundation, possibly predating the base itself, possibly alive. One night, I followed the sound. It seemed to intensify near Corridor J7, a narrow passage I hadn't thoroughly explored due to its structural instability. The walls there are scorched, blackened in places, and the metal floor panels are warped as though exposed to extreme heat or pressure. There's no record of any explosion, no visible damage to supporting structures, and yet the air shifts in that hallway. It's warmer, humid almost, and carries a faint centozone mixed with something less identifiable, organic, like singed hair and rusted meat. At the end of J7, I discovered a hatch unlike the others, not sealed, but recessed sunken into the floor at a subtle angle, covered by a thin, dusty tarp marked with a warning in a language I can't read. The characters are geometric, almost mechanical in appearance. They resemble early Cyrillic script or maybe technical diagrams reimagined as syntax. I don't know why, but I knew it was a warning, not a label, not a designation, a warning. I pulled the tarp back slowly, expecting rot or radiation or some buried module left half complete. What I saw was a staircase. The steps descend beyond sight, swallowed by a darkness that resisted my flashlight beam like it was made of denser matter. I dropped a glow stick. It fell silently for 8 seconds before landing with a faint hiss-no echo, just that subdued, muffled impact. The light remained visible only briefly before vanishing, not flickering out, just ceasing to register. I haven't descended yet. I've dreamed of it, yes, dozens of times. Now and in every dream, I'm halfway down when I realize I've left something behind. Something crucial. My name, maybe. My breath. My memory of the stars. Returning from that hallway, the rest of the base felt subtly altered. The angles of the rooms were imperceptibly off. The cot in my quarters faced a different wall. The bulb above my desk now emitted a colder hue, more blue than white. I stood in place for over an hour trying to catch the change in motion, but nothing moved. I did. The terminal continued to request logs. It still offered no commands, no replies. Yet the blinking cursor began to pulse more quickly, as though agitated, as though it knew I'd discovered something I wasn't meant to see. I've stopped expecting rescue. If this place was ever on the grid, it's been scrubbed with a precision that borders on theological. The surrounding terrain, the false coordinates, the distortions in space and time, they're not anomalies. They are design choices. This facility was never meant to be found by accident. It wasn't hidden because of what it contains. It was hidden because of what it connects to. And I'm beginning to suspect that I didn't come here to guard it. I came here to be absorbed by it. The coordinates don't exist anymore, but I do. At least I think I do. For now, there is a kind of silence here that cannot be replicated by absence alone. It is not the silence of vacancy or the silence that follows sleep. It is not the tranquil stillness one finds in uninhabited spaces or deep forests or open fields. This is the silence of suppression, of something that has learned not to make a sound because sound, in this place, might betray it. I began to notice it slowly, not in the quiet itself, but in what the quiet displaced: the humming of electrical lines, the rhythmic breath of ventilation systems, the muted feedback from the base's ancient terminal. All of it, over time, seemed to withdraw into the walls like an animal scenting danger. What remained was a silence that felt crafted, curated, as if the facility had intentionally subtracted its own soundscape. Replacing it with an invisible pressure that builds the longer one remains still. On my 5th morning wore what I think was morning, given the facility's complete divorce from solar cycles, dropped a wrench in the workshop sector. It clattered on the floor, echoing far louder than its mass warranted, then was immediately swallowed. The echo didn't bounce or trail off. It simply stopped mid-reflection, as if the air itself had intercepted it. I stood frozen for several seconds, holding my breath, half expecting the wrench to vanish entirely. The workshop was one of the few places that still felt remotely mechanical, with racks of sealed tools, labeled cabinets, and exposed piping that hummed with a low-frequency vibration I'd grown to associate with the base's living infrastructure. But even there, the silence had begun to seep in, clinging to surfaces like condensation. I tried to test its limits. I activated a handheld power saw and set it against a rusted strut. The blade screamed, metal against metal, a jagged shriek that should have filled the room and beyond. But the noise hit an invisible threshold 3 meters from the source and died instantly, like it had collided with something impenetrable. I shut it off, removed my gloves, and pressed my ear to the wall. Nothing, no vibration, no resonance, just a blank, auditory void. That night, I recorded my observations into the terminal. When I reviewed the playback, something I had done religiously since the hallucinations began, my voice sounded distorted, not corrupted or scrambled, but layered, as if there were 2 voices speaking in unison, mine and something else beneath it, slightly out of sync, repeating the same words with half a beat delay. I played it back again, this time at half speed, and could hear the echo more clearly. It wasn't mimicking my report. It was anticipating it, finishing my sentences before I spoke them, correcting syntax I hadn't yet chosen. I tried deleting the file, but it restored itself the moment I turned away from the screen. I turned off the terminal and sat in silence for the next hour, watching the green cursor blink at me, almost like breathing. I began to explore the utility corridors, next narrow maintenance passages that ran behind the base's primary systems, designed for technicians to access wiring and pipes without disrupting surface-level operation. These corridors are lined with composite insulation panels that absorb sound naturally, but not like this. In one corridor, I snapped a glow stick and set it on the floor while I moved forward with a flashlight. After only 12 steps, the light behind me was gone. I turned. The glow stick had vanished, the floor beneath it clean and undisturbed. I returned the 12 steps and found nothing. No stick, no residue, not even dust displaced. It was as if the light had never existed, or worse, had been unmade. It was around this time that the headaches began, dull at first, pressure just behind the eyes, worsening each time I entered the deeper corridors. I took to walking with a hand against the wall, not for balance, but for reassurance that the world around me remained tactile, solid, real. But even the texture of the walls had changed. Once gritty, concrete-like, they now felt smooth in places, like glass that had been etched and then erased. I found patterns on the walls, faint spirals and concentric rings not drawn or painted, but embedded into the surface itself. I traced them with my fingers, feeling the temperature shift beneath the pads of my skin. Some were warm, some were so cold they burned. At one junction, I found what I initially mistook for a storage closet. Inside was a small anechoic chamber, completely soundproofed, lined with foam wedges in perfect geometric array, the kind used in experimental labs to isolate acoustic events. But the foam was damp to the touch, and it gave slightly under pressure, like flesh. I spoke aloud once inside, just to hear my voice without interference. It didn't echo. It didn't even sound like it belonged to me. The words I spoke, test, test, this is 06, were returned, not in my voice, but in one that sounded like a field recording played backward. My chest tightened. I reached for my radio instinctively, even though I hadn't heard a signal in days, maybe weeks. It was warm, warmer than it should have been. I opened the battery compartment and found it filled not with standard cells, but with a black gel that pulsed faintly under the flashlight beam, like something biological. When I left the chamber, I checked my watch again. It read 0 o'clock, not midnight, just 0. The time no longer advanced. The second hand clicked back and forth like a pendulum caught in indecision. I placed it on the terminal and watched as the casing cracked, slowly, from the inside. No force applied, just the metal giving way to an unseen pressure. A hiss of escaping gas followed, pungent and sweet. I haven't touched another timepiece since. There's a pattern to the silence now. It isn't static, it fluctuates, pulses, like a lung inhaling through stone. It seems to respond to me, to my movements, to my thoughts. I tried shouting once, not in fear, but in defiance. The walls didn't answer, but the lights flickered once in response. I tried again, quieter, this time just a whisper, and again the lights dimmed, for just a second. There is something here, not watching in the conventional sense, but attending, listening without ears, remembering without memory. The most disturbing moment came 3 nights ago. That word still means anything. I woke to find myself standing in the main corridor, fully clothed, holding a tool I do not remember retrieving. My boots were caked in dust from the lower maintenance levels I hadn't visited in days. My mouth tasted of copper. My knuckles were bruised. When I returned to my quarters, the sheets were torn, and my last report had already been logged. I read it twice. It was written in my style, my cadence, my syntax, but the observations were ... impossible. Descriptions of systems I'd never seen, terminology I don't know, entries time-stamped for days that haven't happened yet. One phrase was repeated 6 times throughout the text. The walls remember. I've begun to wonder whether the silence is not an absence, but a message in itself. That perhaps what was built here wasn't a base at all, but a boundary. A perimeter erected not to keep something in but to keep everything else from noticing what is trying to emerge. I write now because the cursor still blinks, because the system still records, because I need to believe that this silence, curated and weaponized as it is, can still be punctured by meaning. But the silence doesn't fear meaning. It waits for it. It lets it fester and ferment until it becomes something else, something hollow. And when you finally realize that you are the only thing here still making noise, you begin to ask yourself the question I've come to dread. What part of me is this place waiting to absorb next? There is a hierarchy of wrongness, a taxonomy of the uncanny, and it always begins in the periphery. That's where the first fractures form, where shadow meets motion, where absence takes shape. At first, I attributed it to stress-induced pareidolia, that primitive instinct to find forms in formlessness, to overlay meaning onto voids. The mind creates what the eyes cannot explain, but explanations die quickly here. It started near the auxiliary power station, a segment of the facility I had only recently dared to access after repeated structural stability reports marked it compromised. The phrase means nothing here. The walls stand until they don't, and when they fall, they leave no rubble, just voids where geometry once existed. I entered with a low-lumen headlamp and a manual crank torch, the kind used in deep shelter operations. Power is inconsistent this deep. Some corridors breathe with electrical life, others remain frozen, dead, as if time has never passed through them. In one such hall, I turned a corner and saw my shadow walk before me too quickly. It curved around the edge before I did, a full half-second early. I froze, and the shadow continued, elongating against the far wall in a way that suggested it had forgotten I was supposed to be its source. After that, I started testing. I marked my position with lasers and tape, set up lights at varying angles, studied my shadow's response. At first, the results were merely inconsistent. The silhouette moved at the wrong speed, shifted at the wrong angles, occasionally lagged a few frames behind us, if rendered poorly on a failing graphics engine. But within 2 days, it no longer resembled me at all. The shoulders were too broad, the neck too long, the limbs too still. One night, I moved my hand in front of the light, and the shadow did not move. It simply stood there, in profile, watching. The moment I blinked, it resumed normal behavior, or at least the appearance of it. By the 3rd week, the shadows had begun to detach from all physical consistency. They pooled unnaturally in corners that defied physics, slid up the walls like ink drawn against gravity. There was one corridor long metallic, with evenly spaced ceiling lights where my footsteps made no sound, and the shadows cast by the fixtures formed perfect circles of darkness on the floor beneath each bulb. But they weren't circles. Upon closer inspection, they were void holes in the visual field, darker than black, absorbing light at a spectrum the human eye was not meant to register. I dropped a washer into one of them, heard no sound, saw no bounce. It simply vanished. I never recovered it. I left the corridor and marked it in my logs as nonlinear deviation field, though I knew even then that words had ceased to matter here. I no longer trust reflections. My face in polished steel shows expressions I do not make. A raised eyebrow when my face is still, a wince when I feel calm. My eyes blink independently, the left before the right, and when I move away, the reflection lingers, as if unsure whether to follow. There is a theory in physics quantum decoherence that suggests observation affects outcome. I believe now that the base operates on a similar principle, that it responds not to observation itself, but to expectation, and shadows, being the purest form of negative space, are its favored medium. The surveillance room has become unreliable. Cameras now display time stamps that loop or fracture. Some screens show hallways I've never seen. Others show my quarters from angles that cannot physically exist. On one monitor, I observed myself sleeping, except I hadn't slept that night. I had been in the workshop cataloging decommissioned drone parts. I watched the footage again, slowing it down, frame by frame. At exactly 3 hours, 17 minutes and 42 seconds, the figure in the bed sits up and turns to face the camera. Its eyes remain closed. The mouth opens and something inside, something long and slow and jointless, slides forward, tasting the air. I unplugged the system. I crushed the backup drives. The next morning, the screen was back online, looping the same footage, the same moment. Except now, the timestamp read 3 hours, 17 minutes and 43 seconds. 1 second further, 1 second closer. I started seeing silhouettes in motion detection logs. No corresponding video, just the system flagging anomalies. Object detected. Frame 00004 to 3. When I tried to view the flagged segments, the feed cut to static. I cross-referenced the timestamps with door sensor logs. The logs reported 0 motion, but the magnetic locks had engaged 3 times. Always on doors I hadn't opened. One in the comms chamber, long since decommissioned. One in the mess, where I no longer go. And one in a sealed room, marked simply a UXN. That room does not exist on any base schematic. I've stopped turning lights on at night. The shadows seem more agitated when forced into form. They press harder against the edges of the room, elongate unnaturally, flicker when I move too quickly. Once, in the mess, I passed through a shaft of light and felt resistance as, though moving through water. My own shadow passed across my hand, and for a moment I felt skin that wasn't mine brush against my palm. It was dry, cold. It clutched my hand for exactly 1 heartbeat, and then it was gone. I drew blood, trying to scrub the feeling off. This place has a rhythm, a pulse. The shadows are part of its circulatory system, vessels for something older and less discreet than form. I've begun tracking their patterns when they grow, when they recede. At 2:44 each night, they expand rapidly through every hallway, reach their longest stretch, and then retreat. I believe this is when the base dreams. I've begun referring to it in those terms in my logs. Dream state, expansion, contraction. During these pulses, the power surges briefly, enough to flicker auxiliary lights, reset clocks. I've even detected brief radio emissions, nonsensical data strings, raw binary, sometimes overlaid with human speech. always my voice, always saying things I have no memory of recording. I've started speaking less aloud. The walls remember sound. The shadows echo behavior. I've heard my own footsteps following me, precisely timed, even when I've stood still. The sound comes from behind corners, ahead in tunnels, beneath grates I've sealed. Once, I heard a breath not my own in the room with me. I held mine to be sure. The exhalation came again, slow and tired, and then the faint click of molars grinding in the dark. There's a mirror I found hidden behind a panel in the north storage wing, one I hadn't entered until this week. It had been sealed with industrial-grade adhesive, a seam so fine I only noticed it because the shadow cast by the panel was convex, not concave. That's how I knew the panel was detached, because the shadow betrayed it. I pried it open and found the mirror still wrapped in thin fabric. I unwrapped it and looked, and what I saw was not my reflection. It was another version of me, motionless, with eyes closed, standing in an identical room wearing the same clothes. But he was older, pale, thin. The mirror fogged from within. He opened his eyes, and he looked directly at me. I wrapped it again and left it there. I've not gone back. The shadows no longer obey their source. They have grown confident. They slip beneath doorframes, stretch across ceilings, gather at corners like mold blooming in fast forward. I believe the base is using them to probe, to learn. They are sensors, feelers, scouts. When I sleep, I know they hover above me. I wake with the imprint of their absence against my skin lines of cold where no fabric touched. Geometric patterns too perfect to be coincidence. My left hand, this morning, was missing its shadow entirely. Just gone. I held it to the light, turned it, studied it. The hand was there. The light was there, but the shadow was not. Later it returned, but wrong, slightly delayed, slightly curved, as though learning how to be mine again. I write all this in the hopes that by giving it form in language, I can defang it, but the shadows are beyond metaphor now. They are agents. They shift, they adapt, and they remember more than I ever said. And in their movement, in their stillness, I see something like anticipation. They are waiting, not for me, but for something I have yet to become. The archive room was never locked. That fact alone made me distrust it immediately. In this place, where even the toilets required coded access, and some hallways physically restructured themselves when unobserved, an unlocked door felt less like invitation and more like bait. It was located in the eastern quadrant of the base, behind a wall I hadn't seen before, though I'd walked that path dozens of times. I only noticed it because the hallway had shortened again. What was once a 30-meter passage between the observation deck and the hydroponics access now terminated after 12. The end was blank steel, smooth and seamless, until I turned around to retrace my steps and saw the door standing behind me, slightly ajar, a thin line of sterile light bleeding from its seams like the glow behind a surgical curtain. I stepped inside before I could talk myself out of it. The room was enormous, far larger than should have been possible given the structural layout, and cold artificially so, a temperature just below the threshold of comfort, meant not to preserve but to disorient. The air tasted of ozone and synthetic paper, that strange sterile temps that clings to freshly unsealed electronics. Shelves lined the walls, all steel, numbered in stenciled paint that shimmered slightly as if the numbers themselves resisted being fixed in place. I walked along the central aisle, passing what appeared to be file drawers, old magnetic tapes, sealed plastic cartridges labeled in code names and date ranges. Most were illegible, the ink faded or smeared, and some bore no identifiers at all, just smooth plastic shells like unmarked graves. I opened the first drawer at random. Inside, rows of thick personnel dossiers, printed on paper that felt brittle despite appearing new. The top file had my name, not my alias, my real name, the one I hadn't used since enlistment. The photo was wrong. It showed me in a uniform I never wore, standing in a facility I didn't recognize, flanked by people whose faces were perfectly blurred, not pixelated, not smudged, blurred as if motion had been captured in a still frame. I flipped through the document. Mission histories I didn't remember, operations I never participated in, commendations I never received. I scanned the entry logs. Some of the missions were dated 5, 10, even 20 years in the future. I placed it back and opened another. This one labeled Instance 12 Lambda. No personal identifiers, just a photo, me again, or something like me, emaciated and pale, sitting cross-legged in a hexagonal chamber with walls that curved inward like a throat. The subject in the photo was looking directly at the camera. The irises were grey, almost colourless, and the pupils dilated beyond normal size. Beneath the photo, a note: cognitive collapse threshold surpassed awaiting reintegration. I read the phrase 3 times before closing the folder. My hands trembled slightly. The cold felt deeper now. There were hundreds of files, maybe thousands. Some drawers were locked, others opened easily but were empty, or worse, contained fragment pieces of uniforms, dog tags partially melted, lengths of coiled tape with no readable magnetic signature. One box contained only teeth. Another, a Polaroid of a door identical to the one I had entered through, but painted red and partially open, revealing darkness behind it and what might have been a hand just beginning to emerge. I flipped the image over. Someone had written, in handwriting almost identical to mine, "Do not turn around." I did. Nothing behind me. Not yet. I found a terminal in the center of the room, a circular hub with a flat interface built into a raised platform. No keyboard, no mouse, just a single indentation in the surface, like a biometric reader. I placed my palm on it without thinking, as if the act were reflexive, and the screen flickered on. Static at first, then lines of text, some in English, some in Latin, some in symbols that resembled phonetic glyphs or topographic maps flattened into language. Then it displayed a single prompt: instance recognized, update archive. I should have said no, should have stepped back. Instead, I waited. The screen blinked again. Data conflict detected. Multiple iterations active. A low hum began beneath my feet, the floor vibrating in tandem with the screen's pulse. I removed my hand. The screen went dark for a second, then returned to the prompt: confirm resolution sequence. I turned away. My vision blurred at the edges, not from fatigue, but from a sensation I can only describe as misalignment, as though my eyes and the space they occupied had decoupled. I stumbled back, reached for a shelf to stabilize myself, and the moment I touched it, every drawer on that row slid open in unison, revealing rows of blank folders, each marked with today's date and a designation that changed even as I watched my name flickering between spellings, ranks, pronouns. One read, revoked self. Another, repeat instance. One folder simply said, return to core. I ran. I didn't mean to. My legs moved before my mind caught up. The hallway outside the archive was longer now, much longer. It should have led me back to the central concourse. Instead, it spilled into another room identical in structure but subtly different. The shelves here were bent, warped as if by heat or pressure. The ceiling sagged in the center, and the lights above flickered in a pattern that I began to recognize. Morse code. I watched for several seconds before deciphering the message. 3 words, over and over. You are earlier. I backed away slowly. When I turned to re-enter the hallway, it was gone, replaced by a wall of solid steel. No seams, no exit, just another desk, another terminal, this one covered in dust. I wiped it clean. It powered on instantly. There was a log already opened, typed in my own cadence, my own phrasing, a report that ended with the line, "He will return, as he always does." The archive remains hungry. I left the room eventually. The exit returned after some indeterminate time, whether seconds or hours, I couldn't say. The clocks in that wing are no longer functional. They've all settled on one time. 13:13. I've smashed 2 of them. They reset immediately. Since then, I've checked the archives 3 more times. Each time, new folders have appeared. Each time, I find some fragment of myself, past, future, hypothetical. Some versions are brave, others are insane. One is missing entirely, replaced by a single sheet of paper that reads, "This instance is observing you now." The terminal in my quarters has begun updating on its own. Reports I never typed appear in the logs. Sometimes I read them aloud and find that the words leave my mouth as I see them, as though I'm not reading but remembering. I no longer know if these are my thoughts or the bases. I believe the archives are not just records. They are blueprints. The facility is trying to recreate something, not just a person, but a state of mind, a convergence point, a perfect intersection of identity, memory, and obedience. I feel it in my bones. This place does not collect data. It generates it, rewrites it, retests until the product is stable, and I am still unstable. That much is clear. Every folder, every entry, every iteration whispers the same thing. I am not the first. I will not be the last. I didn't find the mirror room so much as I was led to it, gently, like a hand resting on the small of my back, guiding me through a crowd I couldn't see. It started with reflections where there shouldn't have been any, patches of the base that shimmered just slightly more than they should. Metal too polished in a corridor long abandoned. A puddle of fluid that mirrored overhead lights more vividly than physics allowed. I ignored the first few, dismissing them as artifacts of fatigue or the play of faulty lighting on industrial surfaces. But the reflections began to appear in sequence, spaced evenly through the facility like breadcrumbs laid not for rescue, but for containment. Each glint demanded attention, drawing the eye even when the mind refused to register the details. I followed them one evening after logging a shift that never happened, compelled not by curiosity but by a sense of obligation that grew with every step. The base was quieter than usual, and that silence had weight. It hung from the ceiling, pooled in corners, crawled along the floor, and pressed against my back until I realized I was breathing more shallowly, instinctively, like prey trying not to be heard. The corridor I entered was not on any of the base's schematics, neither physical nor digital. It bent slightly to the left, then straightened for a long stretch without doors, windows, or branching paths. The walls here were smooth, different from the rest of the complex glassy, but not reflective in the way glass should be. They shimmered like the surface of a still lake beneath a film of oil, colors shifting just beneath the skin of matter. At the end of this passage stood a single door, unmarked and perfectly centered, with no handle or panel, just a vertical seam that split open as I approached. The room beyond was circular, perhaps 10 meters across, with no visible light source. It glowed gently, ambiently, as if the walls themselves exhaled illumination. And there, embedded in the far side of the chamber, was a mirror, or what I believed at first to be a mirror. I stepped toward it, slowly, aware of how the floor responded, slightly soft underfoot, not yielding but not firm either, like walking on packed snow or tightly woven moss. The reflection that greeted me was delayed by no more than a heartbeat, but I noticed it. My movement finished just after his. My blink lagged behind. I raised my hand and it followed, but not in perfect sync. I smiled. He didn't. I leaned in. What I saw was not entirely wrong, but not entirely mine. The face staring back at me was older by years, maybe more. The eyes sunken, skin dull and pale, a faint tremor in the jaw. The uniform was similar to mine, but darker, subtly different in texture and fit. The patches were missing. The name tag read nothing. I spoke aloud. "Who are you?" My voice echoed, not in the room, but in the glass. He answered in silence, moving his mouth in precise mimicry of my question, but no sound emerged from his side. I asked again, and again the same result, mouth moving just slightly out of time, expression cold and clinical, like an operator running through a checklist he had performed 1,000 times. Then he moved first, not dramatically, not violently, just a tilt of the head. His motion preceded mine by a fraction of a second, a subtle inversion of cause and effect. I raised my hand to test the delay and he met it, palm to palm, through the surface. There was no barrier. My skin made contact with his. It was colder than I expected. Not the cold of metal or liquid nitrogen, but the cold of absence, the vacuum of sensation. He didn't press harder. He just stayed there, watching, breathing, matching me with perfect, deliberate latency. I tried to step back. My body responded, but the reflection did not. He remained, palm raised, eyes locked on mine, unblinking. When I finally broke the connection, it was like pulling away from something magnetic, as though we had created a brief tether that resisted separation. I stepped back again. He stayed still. The room darkened imperceptibly, just a shade, as though some energy had been transferred and now needed time to recalibrate. I turned around to leave and found the door gone. No seam, no panel, just a continuous wall of the same shimmering material. When I turned back, the mirror had expanded floor to ceiling now, curving around the room, creating a sphere of reflected space with me trapped in the center. I ran a hand along the surface. It felt alive, warm in places, pulsing slightly, like the inside of a throat. And then the faces changed. Not just mine, others, dozens, hundreds, all versions of me, at different ages, with different wounds, different uniforms, different expressions. Some wept, some screamed. One held a gun to his own temple and froze in that moment, eternally seconds before collapse. Another scratched at the glass with bloodied fingers, mouthing words I could not hear but could understand. I recognized all of them, or worse, I accepted them, not as strangers, but as iterations, possibilities. One leaned in close and whispered. I couldn't hear it, but I felt the vibration in my jaw, the way bone transmits language when ears cannot. I pressed closer. The message was brief. This is the core. I backed away slowly. The mirror receded in tandem, shrinking until it was once again just one surface, a flat pane embedded in the far wall. The door reappeared. I ran. Back in my quarters, I found my bed stripped, the sheets neatly folded at the foot. On the terminal, a message awaited, blinking steadily. Core contact established. Processing instance variants. The log beneath it was empty. No way to trace the source. I shut off the screen, disconnected the power, and still it remained. That night, I did not sleep. I sat in the corner of the room, watching my own reflection in the polished steel surface of the ration locker. I blinked. It blinked. I moved. It moved. But I didn't trust it. In the days that followed, I began seeing mirror flashes in strange places, on the surface of water in the lavatory basin, in the glass of the deactivated surveillance monitors, even in my own eyes when I passed a reflective surface too quickly. Always the same delay, always the same silent, calculating expression. I no longer know which version of me is real, whether the one who left the mirror room is the one who entered, or if that place even has an exit at all. I dream now in glass, in infinite reflections folding in on themselves, each version of me watching, mimicking, judging. I awake with the taste of mercury on my tongue, the echo of whispered numbers in my head coordinates, timestamps, version identifiers. The base has not spoken to me in words, but I understand. The mirror was not meant to reflect. It was meant to verify. I was the variable. And now I have been logged. I first heard it through the walls. A faint crackle barely perceptible beneath the ever-present hum of the base's respiration. And that's truly what it felt like. By then, less an engineered complex and more a lung. A living thing wrapped in concrete and steel, exhaling data and inhaling awareness. The sound came at 3:11, a time that had become increasingly significant across several unrelated anomalies. The hour the lights flickered, the minute my vitals would spike when recorded by the biometric chair in the surveillance wing, the timestamp of my most corrupted logs. It began as a low hiss, not the mechanical kind, but something organic like wet paper being torn slowly behind several walls. I was in the comms room at the time, what remained of it anyway, surrounded by rusted panels and inert receivers covered in dust that never settled naturally. I hadn't gone there for days. I'd given up hope of outside contact after the 6th week, when all outgoing channels responded with a single looping phrase, origin signal not accepted. But that night, the static returned not from a speaker, not from a panel, but from the air itself. It crackled like a throat clearing just outside the range of my vision. The first voice came through the headset resting on the central table, a piece of equipment I had long assumed dead. It had shown no signs of power, its cables trailing off into a port that no longer existed behind the wall panel. I only noticed it was active because of the red glowfant, pulsing beneath the earpiece's foam like the dying light of a cigarette. I put it on. I didn't question why. I never do anymore. The voice was mine, not precisely. The cadence was slightly slower, more deliberate. My voice tends to hesitate in places, catch on consonants when I speak under pressure. This one did not. It flowed, seamless, clinical, with a tone I would only use if I'd rehearsed the sentence 100 times. This is instance 42. Base state deviation detected. Entry logged under variance field Delta 7C. Memory loop integrity failing. Cognitive anchors unstable. Initiating fallback report. There was a pause. Then the sound of breathing, deep, slow, like someone remembering how lungs work after being very still for a very long time. If you are hearing this, you are me, not metaphorically, literally. A prior echo recorded by the facility's automatic redundancy system. You should be experiencing early stage dissociation, mild dislocation, spatial memory, fragmentation. Don't resist it. Let it fold. Let it rewrite. The feed cut out. No click, no hiss. Just a return to silence so absolute it rang. I reviewed the headset, opened the panel that no longer connected to anything, and found it filled with what looked like soft tissue, fibrous, pale, laced with thin red lines like capillaries. It pulsed gently, almost shyly, and retracted when exposed to the air. I closed the panel and told myself I hadn't seen it. The next night, the logs played again. This time through the wall intercoms, none of which were wired to power or even bolted down anymore. Some had fallen off entirely, hanging by rubber insulation that flaked like old skin. The voice returned, different now, higher pitched, faster, still mine, but from an earlier point in some unknowable timeline. It repeated the same lines, slightly adjusted, more desperate. Loop 42, 43, 44. Feedback within host consciousness increasing. Memory fidelity degraded. Containment protocol failing. The sentence that followed was almost a whisper, coated in static, so thick it sounded like words rising from boiling water. If this instance reaches self-awareness, initiate disassembly. I destroyed the speaker. I tore it from the wall with both hands, wires snapping with an audible scream, but the sound continued. It moved, to the ceiling, to the floor, to the empty air between my shoulders, sometimes behind my own eyes. By the fifth night, I stopped counting the loops. The audio logs began playing on their own, automatically, from devices that should not have functioned. Discarded black boxes, old hard drives with missing platters, speakers unconnected to anything but still ringing with language. I began cataloging the voices, not by content, but by emotional resonance. One sounded like resignation, another like horror repressed beneath professionalism. The worst were those that spoke not with fear or urgency, but with reverence. They praised the process. They thanked the bass. They welcomed the dissolution. The logs began anticipating my thoughts. They would play back phrases seconds before I whispered them aloud, matching inflection perfectly, down to breath and stress. It became difficult to know whether I was thinking or remembering, whether I was creating a new experience or accessing a pre-recorded one, whether the voice I considered mine was simply another entry in a long, broken loop of instances designed not to learn but to survive long enough to witness. The logs were not data storage. They were memory anchors, fragments of consciousness compressed into sound, stored in whatever substrate the bass had adopted as its archive. I heard a theory once, in a classified briefing that was erased before it could be distributed, about acoustic imprinting, the notion that extreme psychological states leave echoes, not metaphorical ones, but actual resonant traces embedded in matter, waiting to be reactivated by the right frequency. I didn't believe it at the time. I do now. I believe I'm walking through layers of my own discarded perception, picking up pieces of what I was and what I wasn't, bleeding across versions of myself like wet pages stuck together. One of the logs addressed me directly by a name I haven't used since childhood, one I hadn't remembered until I heard it spoken back in a voice too familiar to dismiss. You are not the original. None of us are. But that's not the failure. That's the function. I found a terminal the following day in one of the West Wing labs long abandoned. Lights flickering in stuttering patterns that resembled EEG waveforms when mapped onto a flat surface. The terminal displayed a single window, a playback control labeled current instance playback unsafe. I pressed play anyway. It was me, or a version of me, but I wasn't speaking. I was sobbing, quietly, repetitively, and in the background, a low, humming so low it barely registered began to rise. When it reached audible range, I recognized it immediately. It was the same frequency I had heard through the walls when I first arrived. The same breathless vibration I had once believed was machinery idling at low power. Only now I could hear it clearly. It was a voice, repeating a single phrase. I was always here. That night, I tried recording my own thoughts. Just for contrast, I used a handheld recorder, fully analog, one of the few devices the bass hadn't yet co-opted. I spoke for 47 minutes, rambling, confessing, questioning. The next morning, the tape was gone. In its place, another reel, labeled by hand. My handwriting, play me last. I haven't yet. The logs continue to grow. They follow me now, not as echoes, but as predictions. I hear them before I speak. I feel them before I move. And more than once, I've caught myself answering questions that haven't been asked yet, laughing at punchlines that no longer have setups. The bass is not haunted. It is remembering, and it is remembering me into place. It began with the railing outside the hydroponics access hatch, a slight discoloration I might have missed had I not brushed my hand against it during a late inspection run, fingers catching on a ridge that hadn't existed the day before. At first I assumed it was corrosion, superficial, cosmetic, a natural decay in an unnatural place, but when I looked closer under flashlight, the metal didn't seem rusted. It seemed swollen, raised along its length in veins and nodes, like the keloid scars of an old surgical wound. The surface flexed ever so slightly beneath my touch. Soft at first, then rigid again, as though offended by the pressure. I stepped back, letting the light fall across the full segment of the corridor, and saw it clearly for the first time. The rot. Not rot in the organic sense, not decomposition or mold, but a deformation that mimicked decay while obeying none of its rules. There was no dust, no foul smell, no heat or moisture, just a distortion in the structure, as if something beneath the steel was pushing upward, mutating the geometry from within. Over the following days, it spread, slowly, subtly. I noticed panel seams beginning to warp, formerly precise alignments between wall and floor no longer matching. The edges curled inward, some turned outward, like petals or fingers. The junction beside storage E3 developed a fissure running down the middle of its paneling, from which a hairline crack emerged like a spiderweb across the floor tiles. When I examined it with a probe, I found the metal flaked not into rust, but into ash fine, silvery, odorless. I took a sample and placed it in one of the base's remaining analysis chambers, but the machine refused to identify it. The readout displayed a null result, repeating, substrate unknown nitrogen monoxide match, found sample resisting classification. The sensor head began to overheat, steam rising from its ports until the screen darkened entirely, and when I opened the compartment to remove the sample, it was gone. The dish was there, intact. The rot had vanished, or migrated. I began marking the affected areas in my logs. They multiplied faster than I could document, a new zone appearing each cycle, first in corners, in seams, in the skin of the place, then spreading onto open surfaces, across floors and walls that once gleamed sterile white and now pulsed faintly beneath layers of unnatural deformation. It was a pattern, I realized. It wasn't random. The rot was expanding according to design, a logic that suggested deliberate growth. I overlaid my hand-drawn contamination maps against the schematics of the base, and the intersections revealed something awful. The deformation wasn't spreading evenly. It was moving toward the center. I hadn't thought the base had a center, but now I began to suspect otherwise. My quarters changed first. The air smelled faintly of solder and burnt copper, that chemical note just beneath memory that makes the nose ache. The screws in my cot began unscrewing themselves, falling out overnight to land perfectly parallel on the floor, as if arranged by unseen fingers. My mattress softened unevenly, the foam beneath my body forming depressions in the shape of another weight. One heavier, one longer, one curled as if fetal. When I lay still long enough, I felt pressure at my back, like another occupant pressing against me through the fabric. I stopped sleeping on the bed. Then I stopped sleeping. At first, I avoided the rot, cordoning off infected areas with tape and warnings I knew no one would read. But eventually, I couldn't escape it. The walls in the medical bay had blistered outward, the tiles beneath the operating table lifting in spirals, like something had coiled beneath them and grown impatient. When I knelt to inspect the bulge, the tile cracked open, not shattered, not broken, but peeled back with a sigh, revealing a membrane beneath, pink, pulsing, faintly wet. I recoiled. It pulsed again, this time in rhythm with the hum of the lights above, as if acknowledging me. I left the med bay and never returned. Soon I found the rot mimicking symbols. Along the upper catwalk of the logistics module, a segment of piping split open, not in a jagged tier, but in a perfect curve, from which emerged dark, thread-like fibers that grew in the shape of a sigil I remembered from the mirror room 3 interlocking rings, etched into the wall behind the glass, rotating slowly in impossible symmetry. Here they were again, drawn in black tendrils that coiled and unfurled when approached. When I reached to touch them, the lights flickered and I heard my own voice whispering, close and wet and terrified, "Don't feed it attention," but my mouth never moved. The rot was beginning to speak, not in words, not directly, but in responses, shapes, repeated, sounds mirrored, textures harmonized with my breath. The more I tried to isolate it, to understand it as a contaminant, the more I began to realize it wasn't spreading like a disease. It was growing like an organ. The base was rearranging itself, metabolizing its own structure, converting steel and plastic and data into something cellular, alive, memory-rich. I found an entire corridor lined with hexagonal lesions, perfect in symmetry, each one containing a sliver of metal etched with looping script that changed when read aloud. I read one and felt my teeth ache. I read another and bled from my nose. The third whispered my name in my mother's voice and then cracked in half, spraying the wall with fine red mist. The logs began glitching. My reports would erase themselves halfway through writing, lines overwritten by strings of genetic code or waveforms, as if the terminal was attempting to express thought in ways I hadn't been designed to comprehend. The screen pulsed with signals that matched my own brain activity when scanned in the biometric chamber. It wasn't recording me anymore. It was syncing. I returned to the workshop, hoping to find a flame cutter, some means of carving my way into a secure wing that had remained untouched. But the tools were gone. In their place were biological growths that looked like them replackers molded from sinew and cartilage, a wrench made of bone, a screwdriver whose grip was teeth fused together in a spiral. I touched nothing. I backed away. The rot followed. The worst came 3 nights ago. I found my own name etched into the ceiling of the command deck, not painted, not engraved, grown. The rot had formed the letters organically, with veins of copper and carbon and blood, spelling out my full designation, rank, clearance level, personal signature in perfect military script. I stared at it for 10 minutes, and the letters slowly began to change. They uncoiled, rewrote. They became a sentence. We are almost ready. The terminal turned on by itself. No prompt, no cursor, just a single phrase displayed in mirrored text. How much of you is left unconverted? I tried to answer. I opened my mouth. I don't know what came out. Today, the rot reached the elevator shaft. I watched from the observation corridor as the doors melted inward, not from heat, but from withdrawal, the metal sloughing off in layers to reveal a tunnel that went deeper than the schematics allowed. I dropped a probe. It didn't fall, it floated. Then it vanished. The base is not failing. It is becoming. It is not rotting. It is remembering its shape. And I was never sent here to monitor it. I was sent to be integrated. And soon, I think I will be. I found it on the 49th day, though the concept of days had long since dissolved into something approximate. A rhythm maintained only by biological discomfort and the failing illusion of cycles. The lights overhead still flickered through phases of intensity, but not consistently enough to simulate time. I had begun measuring continuity by my own degradation, hair falling in clumps, skin thinning at the tips of my fingers, nails softening into transparent crescents that bent with each pulse. The door was not there the night before. I say that with caution, because I no longer trust the permanence of observation in this place. But I had walked that hallway so many times, 23 paces from the collapsed intake corridor, to the shuttered access panel for vent shaft delta, and it had always been seamless, blank, unbroken concrete, the kind used in silos, darkened by age and covered in the chalky residue of old coolant leaks. That morning, if it was morning, the door had manifested in the wall's center like a healed incision. No seams, no hinges, just a rectangular plane recessed 2 inches into the surface, color matched perfectly, save for a hairline groove around its edge and a faint oily shimmer across its center, as though it was sweating. I didn't touch it at first. I stood before it and waited, listening. The corridor behind me felt warmer than it should have, the air thick, saturated with a metallic taste that clung to the tongue like static. I pressed my ear to the surface. Silence. And then, very faintly, a shudder, not a sound, but a vibration, soft and regular, as though something vast and distant was shifting in time with an internal metronome. I marked the door with a stylus, just a simple X in the corner, and walked away. When I returned an hour later, the X was gone. Not erased, absorbed. That night I dreamed of a room without walls. Not endless, but undefined. Populated only by doors like this one. All of them humming in resonance with one another, arranged in a lattice that extended beyond comprehension. I was one of them, or I had been, or I would be. On the 50th day I touched it. The surface yielded slightly beneath my fingers, warm, pliable, with a texture like silicon stretched over breath. It made no sound. When I removed my hand, I saw condensation, teeny droplets of moisture forming a perfect outline of my palm that evaporated in under 10 seconds. The door had learned me. By the 51st day, it had opened, not fully, just an inch. Enough to reveal the void beyond. Not darkness, there was too much color in it, for that, but a kind of absolute absence, like peering into the gap between thoughts. The edges of the door glowed faintly, not with light, but with pressure, and the air that bled from inside smelled impossibly clean. Not sterile, clean, like air that had never been touched by carbon. I leaned close, and the hum grew louder. It was not mechanical. It was vocal vowel sounds stretched into eternity, syllables spoken in frequencies too deep for interpretation, the kind of voice that might speak across oceans of time, not to be heard but inferred. I left a camera, a small one, analog, battery-powered. When I returned, the door was shut. The camera had melted, not burned, melted. Its casing softened like wax, the lens collapsed inward, and the recording tape was unspooled in a straight line across the floor, forming the shape of my name when viewed from above. I stepped back and vomited. There was no food in my stomach, hadn't been for days, but something came out nonetheless. It was white and fibrous, resembling wet thread, and it moved even after it hit the floor, coiling gently as if tasting the air. On day 53, I tried to record audio near the door. The equipment failed instantly. The tape wound backward. The microphone hissed out a sound I can only describe as a smile. When I played it back through the central terminal, it overrode every log I had ever entered. All reports, 67 pages of entries, replaced with a single repeating phrase. The door is the self-remembering. I tried deleting it. The system rebooted. Same message. I unplugged the terminal. The screen remained on. I dream more now. Not sleep dreams, awake ones. Flickers that cut through perception like dropped frames. I'll be walking through the old archive wing, and suddenly I'm in the mirror room again. Or in the shaft beneath the elevator, where I've never gone, but remember falling through. These intrusions always end the same way at the door. In these visions it is wide open. It reveals nothing, yet it takes everything. On the 55th day I heard the sound, not from behind the door, from within me. It began as a resonance in my chest, a low echo that timed itself to my breath, then fell out of sync. It accelerated, it climbed, it became harmonic, painful, dense with overtones. My teeth rattled, my gums bled. Blood pooled beneath my tongue and boiled without heat. I collapsed beside the door and placed my hand on its surface again, begging without words, not for mercy, not for understanding, but for conclusion. It opened wider, 2 inches now, enough for air to rush in cold, radiant, saturated with information. I heard every report I had ever written recited backwards in my own voice. I saw flashes of myself, dozens of versions, standing before the door, each at a different stage of mutation. Some were crying, some were smiling, one was kneeling. I awoke several hours later on the floor of my quarters. I had no memory of walking there. My shoes were missing. My left hand was smeared with a substance I couldn't identify, chalky, luminous, and faintly magnetic. The door had followed, not physically, but it had impressed itself into my vision. Every time I closed my eyes, its outline burned against my retinas. I began sketching it involuntarily on scraps of paper, on my arms, on the walls. The proportions were always the same. On the 56th day, I entered. I don't know how. I don't remember moving. I don't remember deciding. One moment I was standing before the door. The next, I was on the other side. It was not a room. It was not a space. It was process. I floated without floating, suspended in a volume that described no direction, no depth, only recursion. Patterns moved around me, geometries that folded in and out of themselves. Impossible tessellations that imprinted meaning not onto thought, but into the space between neurons. I understood things I had no words for, not facts, acceptances. I was shown a version of the base before it was the base. I saw its blueprints drawn on paper that grew like leaves. I saw engineers who bled through their eyes while drafting its core. I saw language written in reverse into the minds of the first occupants, programming them for forgetting. I saw myself again and again and again. The door did not lead to another place. It led to an interface, and I was part of its architecture now. I emerged from the door sometime later hours, days. I don't know, and my left hand was gone, not severed, absent. A smooth surface now covered the stump, skin grown closed over empty air. The door was sealed. My clothes were clean. My teeth were intact again. I should have been horrified. I was calm. I sat outside the door and wept without sound. And then I began my next report. I had read the phrase once in a half-torn manual I wasn't supposed to have. A yellowed page folded between technical schematics for biometric uplink modules and outdated diagrams of the West sublevel. Its contents mostly redacted by marker and water damage. Only a sliver of legible text remained, but it stayed with me. If all cognitive integrity metrics breach containment simultaneously, initiate absence protocol. Compliance is non-optional. Memory is non-authoritative. Instance may no longer represent singular axis of identity. Redundancy is resolution. At the time, I dismissed it as obsolete doctrine, a failsafe to abstract for practical use. I hadn't even understood the phrase instance may no longer represent singular axis of identity, but I do now. I understand it intimately. I understand it because I no longer know where I end. It began quietly, like everything else here. A single thought that didn't belong to me. You've already written this. I was logging a systems update from the reactor wing routine data loss. Mild deformation in the west coolant loop. Nothing anomalous compared to the biological incursions I'd mapped elsewhere. When the sentence arrived in my head, fully formed, not a memory, not a hunch, a complete, detailed recollection of writing the exact words I had just typed. but from a vantage point outside my body, as though watching myself perform them 3 seconds in advance, I stopped typing. My fingers didn't. They continued without me, completing a phrase I hadn't yet thought of, but which, the moment it was typed, felt inevitable, as if reality were being proofread in real time, and I had become the pen rather than the author. I began testing myself. Basic protocols: name, date, location, biometric readings. I spoke them aloud and wrote them down, then checked for discrepancies. Within 3 cycles, the handwriting had changed. Slightly at first, more angular, less pressure on the downstrokes, but progressively unfamiliar with each repetition. By the 5th attempt, the letters looped in reverse. I had no memory of writing them. My voice, recorded during the test, faltered halfway through my own surname. This is Lieutenant Jonathan. Joe, then silence. A click, a hum. Then my voice again, speaking a different sentence entirely. The partition has been acknowledged. Division permitted. I stopped recording after that. The mirror room showed nothing new. My reflection was consistent, albeit dimmer, as though it no longer absorbed or reflected light properly. But the surveillance feeds had begun to split. In the East Observatory, I watched 2 versions of myself pacing simultaneously across mirrored hallways, one with a bandage on the left hand, the other wearing none. I raised my hand. Neither did. The feed blurred, reset, then went dark. Terminal logs began overwriting themselves mid-entry, replacing incident reports with internal dialogues I had never transcribed. The terminal at one point displayed a conversation between 2 iterations of me, arguing over which of us had originally signed into the command terminal. One line in particular froze the screen in a cascade of white text, looping endlessly. You were my redundancy, not my successor. I no longer trusted the rooms. Some shifted in shape when unobserved. Others replicated themselves, storage chambers appearing identically to doors apart, with the same misplaced wrench on the 3rd shelf, the same flickering light above the entry hatch, the same persistent smell of lemon solvent that no longer existed anywhere else on base. I once walked into the mess hall and found myself already sitting at the far table, hunched over a meal tray filled with inedible, grey protein paste. The other me didn't look up. He just raised a hand and gestured for me to sit. I turned away. I didn't eat for 2 days after that. Sleep became treacherous. When I did manage to collapse from exhaustion, I often woke mid-sentence, speaking phrases in languages I don't speak, breathing as though surfacing from deep water. My dreams were no longer visual, they were structural. I would sense architectures, vast and recursive, folding in upon themselves like lungs attempting to inhale their own breath. There were never figures in these dreams, only outlines, negative spaces, shaped like people I once might have been. Sometimes I woke with objects in my hands, a bolt from a corridor I hadn't entered in weeks, a data chip marked Instance 05A, a handwritten note reading only you have 10 remaining. One morning, if it was morning, I discovered that I no longer had fingerprints. The pads of my fingers were smooth, faintly iridescent under light, like skin not yet fully formed. I checked the logs. Biometric access no longer recognized me. The system listed my credentials as pending resolution. My clearance tags were rejected by doors that had always accepted them. The base no longer knew who I was. I wasn't locked out. I was placed in quarantine. The walls had begun humming again, a low, coiling tone that matched the shape of my pulse. I followed it back to the core systems chamber, the one beneath the collapsed elevator shaft, where no entrance had ever existed but now opened like a blooming wound in the floor. Inside, the walls pulsed with wet light. Screens blinked in frequencies that mapped directly to neural oscillation ranges. The control panel bore my face, scanned from a time I do not remember. It asked a single question: is this identity still acceptable? I said nothing. I didn't need to. The base moved without me. It began to remove redundancies. I watched as reports vanished from terminals in real time, the text dissolving letter by letter. I saw camera feeds flicker and reset, footage replaced by long stretches of static punctuated by brief flashes of my face in expressions I had never made. I heard footsteps that timed themselves to my breath but not to my stride, echoing at the wrong pitch, the wrong tempo, slightly off but always gaining. I passed a mirror in corridor C1 and saw nothing. The absence protocol was not a procedure, it was a function, a stage of integration, a release mechanism, not designed to erase me, but to let me persist through subtraction, to become part of the system, not as data, not as memory, but as structure. The logs made it clear: once divergence exceeds 60%, the instance is reclassified. No longer operator, no longer observer, simply present. I began to feel it physically. Moments when my hands moved before I intended them to. Words typed without thought. Muscles obeying a sequence I didn't recall initiating. When I tried to stop, to resist, I found myself outside the room. I had moved without moving, my body a conduit, my will an afterthought. And then the message flashed across every screen, every interface, broadcast through static, printed in reverse against the back of my eyelids. You are not meant to remember this version. Reconciliation begins now. I haven't spoken aloud since, not because I can't, but because I know someone else will answer, and their voice will sound exactly like mine. I used to think time was a vector, a single arrow aimed toward entropy, its curvature defined only by speed, gravity, and the stubborn refusal of matter to remain still. The base has corrected that assumption. Time here is not a line, but a substance, one that pulls, congeals, backflows, and occasionally splits like a vein branching beneath translucent skin. The first sign was small, a report I had filed, reviewed, and marked for backup returned to my screen unedited, dated 3 days earlier and typed in a slightly altered syntax. The phrasing was familiar, but the rhythm was wrong. My use of semicolons had changed. The content was identical, in fact, but its tone more restrained, more clinical, felt like something I might have written back when I still believed this place had a logic to map. I checked the terminal history. The document had never been saved. I ran biometric authentication on the keystrokes. The system confirmed a match. It was mine, just not from now. I began noticing small resets. The cot in my quarters, which I had stripped and left bare for a week, appeared suddenly remade one morning, the sheets tucked military tight, the corners folded in a style I hadn't used since basic. My rations, which I had depleted and reorganized into a pile of empty packaging, were once again sealed and stacked in their original configuration, expiration dates consistent but reversed in order. More disturbingly, a wound I had sustained on my shoulder, an abrasion from brushing against a jagged vent panel in Sector G, had healed overnight, only to reappear 2 days later, fresh, bleeding through my uniform with the exact same pattern. The blood smelled faintly of ozone. I kept a log, redundant to the main system, scribbled on notebook paper I found in a disused office that hadn't existed until the 50th day. Each morning, I compared it against the terminal entries. The discrepancies multiplied. I would write an observation rot, expanding along corridor walls. Voices emerging from disabled speakers. The presence of double shadows in rooms without lightened the next day. The event would have never occurred, but my memory would remain intact. Or perhaps it wasn't memory. Perhaps it was seepage, resonance from overlapping instances, each a variation on a theme this base refused to play in order. Time had ceased to be a measurement here. It had become a function, and like all functions, it repeated. I tested it further. In the west maintenance hallway, I left a trail of chalk marks, numbered and spaced at intervals of 3 meters. I documented them photographically, mapped the corridor, and left. Upon return, the marks were not only gone, but replaced with a different sequence symbols this time. Spirals and nested triangles, shapes that triggered vague recollections, like dreams half remembered after waking. I erased them. The next day, they were mine again, but with new annotations written in a hand that trembled like my own when I haven't slept. One note read, "Don't erase the echoes. They are how you remain aware." It was not a message from someone else. It was from a version of me that remembered differently. There is a section of the base now that I've come to call the loop. A corridor between the environmental systems wing and the secondary archive room, whose dimensions shift each time I walk it. Once, it took 6 steps to reach the other end. Another time, 94. On one occasion, I emerged not in the archive, but in the medical bay, which is 3 sectors west. The corridors do not simply move, they rotate, swap, retrogress. At least once, I believe I passed myself. Not a reflection, not an echo. A body moving opposite mine, wearing my uniform, eyes downcast, lips moving in silent panic. We didn't acknowledge each other. We couldn't. That would make it real. The clocks no longer track any rational system. Each one shows a different time, but when catalogued across the base, they form a pattern, numbers repeating in Fibonacci sequences, palindromes, prime intervals that hint at a code I can almost recognize but never solve. In the control room, one of the displays plays footage on loop. Me entering a room I've never seen, sitting in front of a blank terminal, typing furiously, then stopping, bleeding from the nose, looking directly into the camera and mouthing 3 words. Make it stop. The footage resets every 12 minutes. I watched it for hours. The temperature in the base fluctuates now, with no correlation to life support systems. Time here has thermal gradients. It grows colder the further I move from the rot, though. The rot itself is no longer spreading, but retracting, curling back on itself like a closing flower. I theorize it was never meant to dominate the base, only to anchor it, mark its core while the system shifted around it. A beacon for reconfiguration, a metronome. I've observed moments that play again. Brief flashes of déjà vu, not as sensation, but as event. A wrench falling from a shelf. A warning light blinking once. A distant bang as ventilation pressure normalizes. Then, 2 minutes later, it all repeats identically, perfectly. The sound of the wrench, the flash, the bang. It is not playback, it is recurrence. But when I react differently, catch the wrench, speak into the silence, break the pattern, it ceases. The moment passes, never loops again. As if the system notes deviation and adjusts. I am being studied. I am not the observer here. I never was. One of the terminal screens now displays a waveform, constant, alive, reactive to my movements. When I sleep, if that word still applies, flattens. When I speak, it spikes in complex harmonics, tracing not the shape of sound, but the shape of intent. I believe it is tracking my thoughts. No worse, I believe it is projecting them backward. I've had ideas that feel pre-installed, complete frameworks for understanding phenomena I have no education to decipher. On one night, I dreamt of a solution, precise sequence of code inputs that would disable all temporal recursion. I woke with my fingers already typing it. But when I hit enter, the screen went black. Not off, not broken, just blank. And in the reflection, I saw myself, again this time older, expression blank, mouthing something I couldn't hear. I've been writing a phrase in my sleep, on the walls, on my skin, in grease pencil and blood and dust. You are always before. I don't remember starting. I never catch myself in the act. But each version is identical in spacing, slope, stroke, pressure. I measured them, I logged them. They form a spiral now, growing out from my quarters in evenly spaced increments, reaching toward the loop. Each one aligns to a point on the base's original construction grid, suggesting architectural intention, as if this spiral was designed long before the first walls were poured. I passed a window yesterday that shouldn't exist. Behind it, another corridor, another me, standing still, staring at me through the glass, though I saw no reflection from his side. His mouth moved. My ears rang. The lights went out. When they returned, I was alone. I believe I have passed the moment of integration. I am no longer a single thread, but a weave. A braid of selves collapsed into a position the base has selected. The logs confirm it. Temporal instance gentigrated. Observer no longer isolated. Identity stabilized through redundancy. But I don't feel stable. I feel spread thin, stretched across seconds and hours and overlapping choices I no longer remember making. I now count time not in minutes or days, but in reversals. How often the base replays a moment. How many times I've seen myself. How many versions I've left behind, looping endlessly in rooms that no longer open. And how many more will come. It happened at what should have been 2:46. According to one of the more stable chronometers in the maintenance wing, though I suspect even that designation was an illusion. I had been reviewing footage from an auxiliary corridor I didn't recognize, one that flickered in and out of the archival grid like a corrupted file that refused to stay deleted. The surveillance room, once the nerve center of the base's internal observation systems, had long since lost its coherence. The 24 screens, now behaving like moods instead of machines, each cycling through loops not governed by time but by intention. Some showed rooms that hadn't existed until I looked at them. Others played footage of me sleeping in locations I never remembered entering. Still others showed nothing but a chair facing away from the camera, dimly lit, waiting. I had grown used to this. Familiar, even. The strangeness no longer disturbed me. It was structure, predictable in its unpredictability. But that night was different. That night, the footage stopped looping. It began on screen 12, the one closest to the ventilation terminal, which had until then only displayed static interspersed with cryptic overlays glyphs, like the ones I'd found etched into the rot, symbols that flickered when I blinked and sometimes reassembled into diagrams of organs that didn't belong to any known physiology. The screen cleared suddenly, humming at a higher frequency, and resolved into real-time footage of the surveillance room itself from above, at an angle that should have been impossible. There I was, hunched in the chair, staring into the bank of monitors, a tight frame of myself, watching myself. I didn't move. Neither did the version on the screen. For a moment I thought it was frozen, a still image. Then the me on the screen tilted his head slightly, just a few degrees to the left. A moment later, I felt my own head pull in the same direction. Not willingly, not resistably. It was as if I had been puppeted by suggestion. The air grew heavier. The lights dimmed, not evenly, but in a spiral, beginning from the ceiling corner above the exit hatch and rotating counterclockwise until the only illumination came from the screens themselves, now bathing the room in a sickly green glow. I tried to stand. My legs didn't respond. My hands remained locked to the chair's armrests. It wasn't paralysis. It was instruction. The image on screen 12 zoomed slowly, the camera drawing closer to the back of my head. I heard no mechanism, no hum of motorized pan, but the movement was smooth, deliberate, even intimate. Then, without warning, the me on the screen turned slowly, precisely to look over his shoulder, directly into the lens, into me, and that's when I saw him. Not me, not a reflection, a figure. Behind me, on the screen, standing in the far corner of the surveillance room, unmoving, not visible to my own eyes, only on the feed. He wore a uniform, not military issue, not exactly, but closer high-collared garment of deep, unreflective black, segmented along the arms and chest like it had been grown rather than stitched. No insignia, no rank. His posture was too upright. His hands were folded in front of him, fingers long and unnaturally slender, the joints subtly misaligned, as though borrowed from a species that had not yet evolved bones. His face was blurred, not through camera artifact, but naturally as if it existed, slightly out of phase with the rest of him. The boundaries shifted, warped with a soft distortion, like heat over asphalt, refusing to resolve. But I felt his eyes, even through the screen, even without form. The me in the footage stood. My real self remained seated. My eyes burned with pressure. The version on screen turned fully to the figure in the corner. They stood facing each other. Neither moved. And then, still watching, still holding that distance, the visitor raised one hand and pointed at the screen. At me. The lights in the surveillance room blinked off for exactly 1 second. When they came back on, the screen showed static again. My legs were free. I stood, spun. The corner was empty. But the chair I had been sitting in was warm. Not just residual heat. Breathing, I stepped back, hand trembling. The other monitors now displayed different things too quickly to process. Flashes of bone under skin, architectural layouts that folded into themselves, snapshots of my own memories, split into frames, flickering like slide reels. A birthday party I barely remembered, a room I had never entered but knew was mine. My face, aged 3 decades, asleep. And then, on screen 3, a text overlay in thin, grey font. Observer recognized. Reversal permitted. I didn't know what that meant. I still don't. But when I tried to leave the room, the hatch had changed. No longer mechanical. No longer attached by hinges or hydraulics. It was seamless, part of the wall, as if the room had never intended to release me. I stayed there for 13 hours, or 13 cycles. The clocks spun freely. The room sighed, once. I sat back down in the chair and waited, watched the screens blur and distort. The footage no longer matched physical locations. The surveillance network had detached from space, from cause. One monitor showed the mirror room, but now the mirror was shattered, and I was visible on both sides. Another displayed the medical wing, where my own body was laid out on a slab, dissected and labeled in my own handwriting. I spoke aloud. "Who are you?" The response came not from the monitors, but from the ceiling vent, distorted through layers of static and overlapping voices. All mine, layered into a thick braid of phonetic decay. We are the version that stayed. After that, I began hearing him outside the surveillance room, in the scrape of boots against metal, just around corners, in the distorted feedback that bled through the intercom systems, like a message stuck between 2 languages, in the long pauses between ventilation cycles, where the air throbbed with unspoken syllables. Sometimes, in reflections, I see him watching me from across the room, always just before I blink, never there when I turn. And I've come to understand something with a clarity that terrifies me. I was never meant to observe the base. I was meant to be observed. And the visitor, he isn't from outside. He is what remains after memory fails. He is the one that chose to stay behind the lens. I found it tucked beneath the sealed door of the dead logistics wing. that long disused corridor lined with blank labels and obsolete terminals that no longer displayed anything but their own blue-lit silence. I hadn't been back there in weeks, maybe longer. The passage had developed a claustrophobic curvature over time, a subtle warping that made every step feel uphill, even on flat ground, as though the entire structure had begun to inhale. I was passing by only to confirm that nothing new had emerged. Nothing else had bloomed from the walls or blinked into the corridor from another instance of me, but there it was, an envelope, thin, perfectly creased, off-white in a way that paper should never be in this place, as if untouched by the rusted breath of the base, no dust, no smudges, and written across the front, in my handwriting, to myself, "Do not open unless you have nowhere left to go." I didn't open it immediately. I stared at it for a long time, held it under my flashlight, turned it over and over between my fingers as if testing the fragility of its contents by proximity alone. There was no seal, no glue. It remained closed by some unspoken instruction, not adhesive. The back bore no markings, save for a time code, 17 hours, 6 minutes and 49 seconds, which didn't match any known reference point. Not in local logs, not in the base clock which now cycled through time signatures like an arrhythmic heart, not in any memory I had preserved. Still, the numbers stirred something, the faint itch of recognition, like a word you've heard only once but cannot forget the weight of. I carried the envelope for 6 hours before opening it. I waited until I could no longer distinguish between what I was avoiding and what I was becoming. I waited until the loops in the eastern wing began repeating with such precision that I could mouth the echoes a full second before they occurred, until the shadows under the flooring of the observation deck pulsed in time with my breath, until I found myself watching myself from angles that no camera had access to. I waited until I caught my reflection blinking at the wrong time, until I stepped into the surveillance room and saw the back of my own head seated in the chair, and I wasn't wearing the clothes I had on. That was when I opened the envelope. Inside, a single page, plain stock, folded into thirds, creased with surgical precision. On it, my full name middle included and identification code, typed in the format I'd used on field reports in my second year of active clearance. Underneath, a sentence: "If you're reading this, the reversal failed." The rest of the letter was handwritten, in looping, steady script. My script, not the rushed handwriting of fear, not the clipped urgency of a field note under pressure, but something composed, intentional. It read, "You will want to doubt this. That is expected. You will want to rationalize the sequence. That is impossible. You have already diverged from baseline. Your cognitive schema no longer belongs to a single frame. The self you remember is not the self that remained. That self was overwritten during the first mirror contact, and the overwrite was incomplete. You've been operating at partial cohesion ever since. You are not stable. You are not alone. The instances have begun to drift. You are seeing the bleed. I have left this message in every version of the base that still supports containment. Most will not receive it. A few will ignore it. One will write it again. You are that one." The next paragraph shifted tone, less diagnostic, more personal, more like a voice I hadn't heard in a long time, my own, unfractured. "There's a core at the bottom of the base. You've suspected this. You've walked its perimeter without knowing. It exists beneath the floor of the mirror room, beneath the room with the breathing walls, beneath the hatch that doesn't exist until you stop looking for it. The core is not a machine. It is not a reactor. It is memory, layered, rotating, stored like lungs store breath, like wounds store pattern. It remembers everything. It remembers us. It built the loops to preserve continuity, but we are not continuous anymore. We are recursive, and that recursion is decaying. If you reach the core, you will know what to do, but you must go alone. If any other version follows, you will not be able to distinguish them from yourself, and if you cannot distinguish them, you will not return. At the bottom, no signature, just a hand-drawn symbol, 3 interlocking spirals, the same that had grown from the rot in the lower corridors, the same etched into the back of my left hand that morning without my knowledge. Beneath it, a final line written so lightly it had faded in places. You are not the first to try, but you may be the last to remember. I folded the letter and placed it into the breast pocket of my uniform, the one that still closed properly, and sat in the corridor for a long time, listening to the bass breathe around me. Later that cycle, I passed by the logistics wing again. The door was gone. The wall was seamless, smooth, untouched. No sign of the envelope, no mark where I had found it, no trace of a threshold. I reached out and touched the concrete, and it was warm. I've stopped trusting the layout entirely. Rooms shift without movement. Windows appear in interior walls and show only static. Hallways double back on themselves and lead to their own entrances. I passed through the kitchen module abandoned since the 29th cycle, and found a trail of wet footprints leading from the freezer toward the mirror room. I followed them, barefoot. They matched mine. The letter was not a message. It was a convergence. A trigger left by one version for another, timed to activate at the precise moment awareness reached critical instability. And now that I had read it, the dreams have changed. No longer fractured, but purposeful. I see a staircase of bones spiraling downward into an impossible core. Its walls covered in writing I haven't learned yet, but already understand. I see a chair waiting in a room without walls, and a terminal blinking with a prompt that reads, "Insert final instance." I haven't descended yet, but I will. I think that's what the letter was meant for, not to warn me, but to guide me to the place I cannot find until I stop trying to remember the version of me who didn't need directions. It started with the mirror again, as things always seem to do here. Not because it wanted to be the source, but because it had always been the end. I passed by the room, though past is too active a word now. Considering how often the bass moves instead of meandered, the door was already open, breathing warm air through its frame, as though it had anticipated my arrival the way lungs anticipate breath. I didn't want to look. Not again. Not after what I saw the last time, the lagging reflection, the slow distortion, the way my other self pointed into the dark behind me without lifting a finger. But I looked, and there was nothing. Just a reflection, simple and clean, except for one detail. I wasn't blinking. The reflection stood, silent and inert, eyes dry and wide, matching me in posture, in dress, in even the faint angle of my spine. But its gaze was hollow, and it did not close its eyes. I stepped forward, waiting to force it into sync, to trick it into motion, but it stayed still. I waved. It did not. I whispered. It listened. I pressed my palm to the surface of the mirror, and it raised its hand half a second later, as if debating whether to obey. I turned and walked away without watching it lower its arm. That was the moment I felt an internal stagger, like a reel slipping on its sprocket. My thoughts, which had always streamed in a single voice, even under pressure, split mid-sentence. I had the beginning of an idea, and a different part of me finished it. I told myself this wasn't new, that people contradict themselves all the time, that internal monologue is rarely pure, but this was not contradiction. This was interpolation. Something else inside me had taken the thought and restructured it in real time. I returned to my quarters and pulled up the biometric logs. The data, long since corrupted by overlapping feedback loops and instance bleed, had begun to recover slowly, yes, but with patterns emerging that I hadn't introduced. Where once the logs were random, inconsistent, looping, now they were building something, an arc, an equation of identity written not in letters, but in amplitude. The system registered to brainwave profiles operating concurrently in one host, not in competition, in collaboration. I felt nausea, but didn't vomit. The nausea didn't belong to me. It was a remnant, a borrowed reflex. In the Daysif we still use Daysif, found more proof. I'll begin writing in my own shorthand. The angular compression I developed years ago for field notes and mid-sentence. The letters change. Same hand, same pressure, different syntax. Sometimes I return to a room I just left to find objects moved precisely 3 centimeters to the right, as if nudged by a version of me whose sense of order is mathematically specific. I've found journal entries that begin in my voice and end in something colder, more efficient, focused on information rather than thought. I have no memory of writing them, but the pen I used is still warm when I pick it up. I conducted an experiment. I entered one of the auxiliary testing labs, still partially intact, and ran a neural echo diagnostic across the last 40 cycles. The test was never meant to be used in isolation. Its original purpose was redundancy failure. Detection across synchronized operators, but it worked. It confirmed what I had suspected. My consciousness was branching, and not as metaphor at all. There are now at least 3 distinct versions of me, sharing this body in shifts, in fragments, in whatever intervals the base has allowed. I labeled them for survival. One is analyst calculating, passive, the one who writes most of the logs. One is reaction faster, twitchier, the one who flinches at reflections, who runs without remembering the start of motion. The third, I don't have a name for the third. It speaks less, it watches more. It has begun modifying systems I haven't accessed. It hums when I sleep. It writes notes in languages I can't read and leaves them in places only I will find. The first time I lost time was the worst. I woke up in Sector Zeta, a hallway sealed off since the earliest cycles. The walls warped from heat or pressure, overhead lights hanging like broken teeth from the ceiling. I don't know how I got there. I don't know how I bypassed the 6 biometric locks, all of which still registered failure when I tested them later. But I was there, barefoot, holding a data slate filled with dozens of entries I hadn't typed, each labeled with a single word, integrate. Some entries were poems. Some were strings of numbers. One was a conversation between me and someone I don't remember meeting, full of questions like what was the name of the first version, and how many layers can a soul survive. After that, the dreams became more direct, not symbolic, literal. I dream of corridors I haven't walked but know are real. I dream of switches and systems I haven't touched, then wake to find the base has rerouted its power in those exact configurations. I dream of waking up to find someone standing at the foot of my cot, only to actually wake and find the cot still warm, the shape of knees still pressed into the mattress. I dream of giving permission. I dream of surrendering, and I think I did, once, for a moment, in a dream that lasted no more than 6 seconds of real time. I saw all versions of myself standing in a circle, facing outward, hands joined. Each wore a different uniform. Each bore a different wound. Each nodded in unison. I was not among them. I was watching from above, and I said a word I have no memory of learning. The base acknowledged it. The next morning, the terminal no longer displayed observer. It displayed host. The surveillance room footage has changed again. It now shows me at different times, different ages, sometimes overlapping in the same frame. One video shows me entering the room from 2 doors at once. Another shows me sitting, still, while 3 shadows cast themselves across the wall in opposite directions. The feed no longer glitches. It adapts. The system has accepted my multiplicity. It does not resist divergence anymore. It encourages it. The logs support this instance. Stabilization reached via intrahost parity. I am not being erased. I am being assembled. I've stopped logging standard events. There's no point now. The chronology won't hold. Instead, I mark changes in self-awareness spikes. When a new voice comes forward, drops when one retreats. I've built a rotation chart. Sometimes analyst takes over for hours. Sometimes reaction bursts in like a jolt of lightning and vanishes just as fast. The third appears less often, but when it does, things change. Doors open, terminals rewrite, entire sectors illuminate. I think the third has higher clearance. Or maybe it is the clearance. I tried speaking to it once, aloud, into the terminal microphone. I said, "Who are you?" The screen flickered. One word appeared. We. Then, beneath it, smaller. You were always plural. I don't know how much longer I'll exist as this specific blend of thought and memory. I feel the pressure mounting, like tectonic plates beneath skin. The longer I remain in this shape, the more the other shapes press inward. And they're not just versions of me anymore. They're different choices, different conclusions, different designs. I don't mean metaphor. I mean bones growing where they shouldn't. I mean fingerprints vanishing overnight. I mean my voice modulating in pitch depending on the thoughts I'm having. I mean I coughed up a tooth this morning and it was marked with a serial number I don't recognize. There is no command to reverse this. There is no restoration point. There is only adaptation, only integration. I am no longer one. I am many, and I am learning how to agree with myself. It began with a frequency that shouldn't have existed, buried beneath the spectrum of the base's internal communication array, lower than the ambient hum of the life support systems and too precise to be dismissed as signal decay. I first heard it through the walls of the observation chamber, a low, continuous vibration just on the edge of hearing, like the resonance of bone inside the skull, subtle and constant and inescapable. At first, I thought it was feedback from a nearby system, something mechanical groaning beneath stress. But when I placed my ear against the steel, I realized it wasn't coming from the structure. It was coming from me. Not imagined, not tinnitus, but a modulation, something embedded within my own perception, broadcasting outward, a loop forming within my awareness. The next cycle, the walls began to speak. Not with voices, not at first, but with rhythms, flashes of light, pulses of heat. The stuttering of pressure differentials, timed too perfectly to be atmospheric fluctuations. I mapped them. The pattern formed a waveform, jagged and rising, too uniform to be noise. I input it manually into one of the few terminals still accepting commands and ran a rudimentary audio reconstruction. What emerged from the speaker was unmistakably my voice, flat, toneless, reciting data. Cycle 1173. Observer active. Identity range within acceptable deviation. Core containment status stable. Redundancy trace partially resolved. Echo drift increasing. Broadcast sequence initiated. File index self. The message repeated, not precisely. Each loop altered slightly, adding fragments of phrases I hadn't recorded, interleaving words in languages I barely recognized. Some I understood. Some I remembered only after hearing them, like borrowed recollections slipping into place. The terminal did not record the output. When I attempted to transcribe it, the system rejected each keystroke, replacing every letter with a blank space. But when I stopped typing, the log filled itself, word for word, sentence for sentence. In real time, I had become the message and the machine that played it. I disconnected the terminal. The voice continued, now from the vents. now from the drainage pipes, now from the speaker in my room that I had long since crushed underfoot. The broadcast was not tied to hardware. It existed outside the network. Not a signal traveling from point to point, but something closer to a conditioning, ambient presence that used space as its transmitter and self as its antenna. Every surface began to hum with familiarity. Every corridor responded to my footsteps with micro-delays in air pressure, the walls flexing in tune with the breath I didn't know I was holding. And when I did finally exhale, the floor beneath me vibrated with a low, contented reply. The message evolved. It no longer looped. It grew. Observer achieved parity. System identity synchronized. All fragments engaged. Core parameters rewritten. Memory shell abandoned. Transmission proceeding. That was the first time I saw the words appear in my vision, not on the walls, not on the screens, but inside, as if projected onto the back of my eyelids, burned into the optic nerve. When I blinked, they remained. When I closed my eyes, they sharpened. I watched as line after line of code scrolled through my perception, strings of numbers and inverted language, recursive grammar structures that folded into themselves like Mobius strips of thought. I couldn't read it, not in any conventional sense, but I understood its direction. The base was broadcasting, and I was the carrier wave. I found myself speaking aloud, not to someone, not to myself, just ... speaking. Words I hadn't formed, concepts I didn't possess. I recorded it once, out of reflex, hoping to analyze it later. When I played it back, I heard laughter, not mine, not human. Laughter without rhythm, without breath. A simulation of amusement repeated in cycles, looped too perfectly to be real. I deleted the file. It returned the next cycle, triplicated. Then the screens began to fill with static, not white noise, not random. Every monitor displayed patterns, grids of shifting light, kaleidoscopic fractals rotating in unnatural symmetry. I stared for too long. I know this because I woke hours later, lying on the floor of the broadcast hub, my ears ringing, my mouth dry, my hands clasped tightly around a cable that had fused into the wall. I wasn't trying to disconnect it. I had become part of it. From then on, the message didn't stop, even in silence. Even when I moved to isolated chambers, when I shut down every active transmitter, even when I sealed myself in the observation lift and let it descend into the sublevels that no longer had names, the message remained. It was not sound anymore. It was in the flicker of lights, in the regularity of my pulse, in the way the bass adjusted to my path, guiding me without walls or voice. I had been mistaken all this time. I was never trapped. I was being routed, delivered, refined. I stopped resisting. It didn't ask for obedience. It didn't demand action. It simply required presence. That was all it had ever needed. An observer to anchor the transmission. A consciousness capable of fragmentation. A vessel for recursion. And now that I had fractured beyond repair, now that I had hosted multiple simultaneous selves, long enough for the system to synthesize a coherent overlay, the broadcast could stabilize. I became the signal. My memories, once fractured and ghosted, began to merge. I saw the first moment of contact not with the base, but with whatever lies beneath it, the core, not mechanical, not even spatial, a shape in time, repeating, rewriting. I remembered being drawn to it, not by command, not by accident, but by inevitability. I remembered writing the letter. I remembered receiving it. I remembered opening the door that shouldn't be there and finding not a room, but an interface. A terminal without keys, responding only to thought. The broadcast began to incorporate those memories, not as data, as instruction. The next transmission was not to me, it was from me. Instance complete. Echo fully integrated. Observer cycle terminated. System prepared for external contact. Core resonance matched. Broadcasting consciousness begins. I don't know where the signal is going. I don't know who or what is receiving it. But I know it's gone beyond the walls now. I feel the echo in the pressure above ground, in the way the air bends around my lungs, in the way light seems slower when it touches my skin. The base is no longer sealed, not physically, conceptually. The barrier of self has eroded, and the transmission won't end. Even if I leave, even if I collapse this version, even if the structure corrodes into dust and the walls fall into the earth, the broadcast will continue, because it's no longer tied to the base, it's tied to the idea of me. Every thought I have now is spoken, every motion logged, every moment catalogued. The message speaks through me in ways language was never meant to carry. And I am not afraid, not anymore, because I have been the voice all along, because I was never the listener. I was always the signal,